Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm just going to briefly introduce the moderator, and then she will take over for the panel. We do have a reception following. I expect, since this was for students, there may be students trickling in as we get closer to the food. Not to say that students
don't need career advice.
No. Since there are not that many students here yet, I will say that students want us to do more career events, and then they are not always well attended. And it might be Friday afternoon, and the weather is nice, but we will see. And if not, we will ask questions ourselves, because I think this is going to be a really interesting panel. Okay. So I'm just going to introduce Liz Malinkin. She is our academic program manager for the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. In this role, she administers the Center for Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies. Her master's thesis focused on ethnic minorities in the Moscow labor market, and she got her degree in Russian and Eastern European Studies from the University of Michigan in 2006. Previously, she worked at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., where she oversaw the Kennan Institute's fellowship programs and conducted research on migration in Eurasia. So she is also an alum, and she will be moderating this panel on international and regional studies careers. Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you, Mary. It's such an honor to be asked to moderate this last panel of the symposium, and such an inspiring group of people. So I'm excited for the conversation. I know there's people on Zoom as well, but people in the room, please feel free to come closer. We intend this to be kind of more of a conversation after I'll introduce each panelist and allow them to talk about their career career trajectory, and then we'll have questions. So thank you everyone for coming, and I will start with, we'll just go down the table. I'm very pleased to introduce Jan Berris, who is the Vice President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, where she has worked since 1971, beginning as a program associate, moving on to program director, and now she's the Vice President. She oversees all program activities of the committee, which includes preparing and organizing the visits to the U.S. of hundreds of Chinese delegations, including the 1972 Chinese ping pong team. I definitely I'm excited about that. The first PRC group to come to this country, and sending hundreds of American delegations to China. She has traveled to China over 165 times since 1973, with people in groups as diverse as a tennis team and a Supreme Court justice. Her work also includes developing ongoing flagship programs such as the Public Intellectuals Program, the U.S. Foreign, that's my background coming through, U.S. Foreign Policy Colloquium, Young Leaders Forum, and the committee's Track 2 projects. At the request of the State Department, she coordinated Chinese press activities during Premier Deng's February 1979 visit to the U.S., and has been the lead for the committee's hosting of major welcoming events for all of the senior-most Chinese leaders. Prior to her work at the committee, Ms. Berris was a Foreign Service officer stationed at the U.S. Consulate in Hong Kong and in D.C. She has a BA in Chinese Studies from the University of Michigan and an MA in Japanese Studies, also from the University of Michigan. So I give the floor to Jan. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I'm very happy to be here today. Mic's on?
Oh, yes, if you just hit it once.
Okay, start again. Thank you, Liz. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon to help celebrate the 30th anniversary of Michigan's International Institute, which wasn't even a gleam in anybody's eye when I was on campus for 6 years back in the 60s. From what I heard last night, the Institute's been doing very well, and I have no doubt that it will continue to do so at least as long as the terrific Mary Gallagher is in charge. So a big shout out to someone who I think is really does a great job at whatever she puts her hand to. I want to apologize because my mother, who would probably turn over in her grave if she saw what I'm going to do, because she used to teach public speaking. And she would always say, first of all, never apologize for anything when you start to speak. And second, never use notes. But I've had a really busy last couple of weeks and didn't have enough time to do what my mother taught me, was just to write it weeks in advance and then think about it in your head. So I will apologize that on occasion, or more than one occasion, I may turn to my notes. But as Liz just mentioned, I've been fortunate enough to have had two wonderful careers, one relatively brief in the Foreign Service, and the other, as you heard, quite long, over a half of a century. Much to my family, because it's still continuing, I haven't left it yet, and that's much to my family and friends' dismay. Both were in the international arena, more specifically in China and Greater China. And whatever success I've had in both of those careers is really in large part due to the University of Michigan. First of all, in the training that it gave me, but for me, more importantly, is because of the wonderful professors that I had, who were really interested in me as a person and in my career. And not just saying that because I'm up here on this panel, but it's really true. When I arrived at Michigan, I knew I wanted to study Asia. I wasn't quite sure if that was going to be China, Japan, Southeast Asia was a close third. And so I wanted that because I'd been fascinated by Asia ever since I was a child, which was a little strange because I had no missionaries in my family, Jewish girl from Detroit, no traders, everybody would say, why Asia? What's, especially in the 60s. And I don't know why, but when it came to choosing my freshman courses, I didn't really have anything to fall back on in terms of what I didn't know what I wanted. And so I listened to the advice of my very handsome freshman advisor. He thought that China was going to be the wave of the future. So he said, definitely China. I thought, okay, I'll do that, and I can win his heart by learning how to order in a Chinese restaurant. Now, I do have the legitimate cover of the fact that the Japanese 101 course conflicted with a required zoology course that I had to take, and the Chinese 101 course didn't. But it's more fun to tell people it's because it was the handsome advisor. So my undergraduate degree, as Liz has said, was in Chinese studies. My master's was in Japanese studies, although throughout my undergraduate years, I was taking classes in Japan and Southeast Asia as well. I had planned to go to graduate school, but, and this is an instant where a Michigan professor was not helpful, I had a professor who said, oh, you want to go to Yale? I just came from Yale. I know everybody there. Don't worry. I'll write you a letter. You'll get in, no problem. The day the rejection letter came in, and I went up to him over in Lane Hall, tears streaming down my face, he said, oh, well, that's a shame, and then went on to the next student. So when I didn't get into Yale, I had to sort of figure out what to do. Unlike today, where there are lots of choices for people who have a background in Chinese or Japanese studies, there weren't a whole lot of options in 1966. And to be honest, I hadn't really come to Michigan and studied Chinese to prepare for a career. I came here and I studied what I studied because I was really interested in it and passionate about it. So not knowing what to do, President Kennedy had been on the steps of the Union 2 or 3 years earlier and announced the Peace Corps, so I took the Peace Corps test, and I got accepted for that. But I also had another job offer. My mother used to go to this ladies' dress shop in Detroit all the time, and she loved, her favorite sport was bragging about her children, and she had told the owner of the shop that I spoke Chinese. And so a couple of weeks after graduation, I was in the store with her, and the owner came up and said, your mother tells me you speak Chinese. I said, yes. He said, well, what are you going to do? now that you've graduated? I said, I have no idea. He said, well, how would you like to go to Hong Kong and be my dress buyer? I had not a clue what it would mean to be a dress buyer, but I thought it sounded really cool. About 2 weeks after that, I was back up here at Michigan because when I was, one of my favorite classes as an undergraduate was a history of music course that Professor Bill Malm taught. And I had taken his European course, and then I took his Asian music course, and got really turned on by Japanese music. And then it was he had 3 different Japanese orchestras. I was in them all. And then he had enough money in my senior year to buy a gamelan. For those of you who don't know, a gamelan is a big, you should, because there's a wonderful gamelan here at Michigan, thanks to Bill Malm. It's a big Indonesian, mostly percussion orchestra. So I had played in it, and I loved it. So in my senior year and throughout my my master's, and then I also stayed on at Michigan for a year doing research work for another Chinese professor that I'll talk about in a minute. Anyway, we had a concert, and I was asked to come back up to play in the concert at Hill Auditorium. And after the concert, we had a party at someone's house. And I was sitting next to Professor Malm, and he said to me, so, where are you going to graduate school? I said, well, I'm not. He said, so what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to Hong Kong and be a dress buyer. And he said, you're doing what? He said, you can't waste your 4 years at the University of Michigan and all the time that your professors have poured this knowledge into your head to go buy dresses in Hong Kong. I refuse to let you do that. Tomorrow morning, you go over to Lane Hall and you talk to Professor Foreworker and you tell him to let you into the China MA program. It was this was August, by the way, and he thought I could do that. Things were a lot looser in those days than they are now. But anyway, I very timidly, because I'm not afraid of most people, as my former boss who's sitting there will tell you, but I was very afraid of Professor Foreworker. He was really intimidating to students. Later, when I got to know him, he was a lovely, lovely man, but as a student, I was petrified around him. So I go in, and I said, Professor Foreworker, Professor Malm says that I should come ask you if I can be in the master's program. And without blinking, he sort of reaches behind him and takes a book off the shelf, all in Chinese, and hands it to me and said, read it. I said, I'm sorry, I can't. I have a valid reason for that, but it has to do with Michigan, too, but no time for that. So I said I couldn't. He said, well, if you can't, I'm sorry, but you can't be in my class because I require all of my students to write their MA thesis using original source material. So very unhappily, I walked out the door, and right across from his office was the office of Professor Robert Ward, who was the head of the Japan department. His light was on. Very serendipitously, his light was on. If it hadn't been, my whole life would have been quite different. I knocked on the door, and he said, come in, and I made no reference to my previous conversation with Professor Foreworker. I said, Professor Malm says that I should come over and ask you if I could be in the Japanese MA class. And he said, sure. I said, I don't speak Japanese. He said, I know. He said, but you speak Chinese, right? And I said, yes, which was true. I could speak it. I just couldn't read it very well. So he said, fine, I'll see you in class in like 4 weeks. It was coming up very soon. So I got my master's. I decided to do it in 1 year. I have no knowledge of why I did that, because at the end of that year, I still had no clue what I wanted to do. Once I got my master's, I worked for Professor Dick Solomon, as I mentioned. Dick was the first professor of political science working on China that the university had hired. He was writing a book, so I helped him do that. And all the time I was helping Dick do that, I was taking lots of exams, government exams, because that was one of the few places you could use, or I felt I could use my Chinese. And to my surprise, I passed the Foreign Service exam, at least the written part, which to me was a huge thing because it was the mother of all tests, but I was not going to take, it's a 2-part test, and I wasn't going to go to Washington to take the oral part because two Foreign Service officers on leave had spent some time at Michigan in Lane Hall, and I had gotten to know them. And when I told them I passed the exam, they all said, "Oh, the written part's hard, but the oral part is just awful, and it's all they want to do is try to trip you up." So I wasn't going to go, but my mother, who believed I could do anything I put my into, she would not let up, and so I, just to keep her off my back and quiet, I went to Washington. I took the oral exam. It was a lot more fun than those guys had told me it was, and I found myself 3 months later in the Foreign Service's A100 course. So I then found myself 6 months later in Hong Kong, where I spent 2 wonderful years as the Assistant Cultural Affairs Officer. My next posting was supposed to be in Surabaya, Indonesia, where I was going to head the Cultural Affairs Office in the consulate. I had never heard of Surabaya, to be honest, and most people who I asked, who should have known because they were working in a consulate in Hong Kong, they didn't know much about it either, except that it had Komodo dragons. That was when I asked people, well, what can you do in Surabaya? They said, well, the Komodo dragons at the zoo are a lot of fun. So I really didn't know that I wanted to do it, but the attraction for me was the gamelan. Finally, I could be in a place where I could listen to gamelan music all day. I could play in it to my heart's content. So that's what I was going to do. But while I was back on home leave, just about 3 or 4 days before I was supposed to go to Washington to learn Indonesian, or to begin learning Indonesian, I got a call from Professor Solomon and another Michigan professor, Alex Eckstein, who was head of the econ department here, and also he was in the econ department. He was head of the China Center, and he was also the chairman of an organization called the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which was based in New York. And Dick said to me, "I know you're on your way to Washington, but would you please come up to Ann Arbor and talk to me and Alex?" So I would always do whatever Dick Solomon asked me to do, so I drove up here, met them over in Lane Hall, and to my surprise, they asked me if I would take a year's leave of absence from the Foreign Service to work in this organization that Alex was the chairman of and that Dick was on the board, of which Dick, that I shouldn't end a sentence with a preposition, but Dick was on the board of that organization. So, and I knew about it because while I had been working both getting my MA and as well as working for Dick Solomon, I also worked doing a lot of administrative and secretarial work at both the Chinese and the Japanese departments. And while I was doing that, this organization, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, ran 2 conferences at Michigan, and I was sort of the lead person, liaison person for them for those meetings. And it was funny because, ironically, the woman who came with them, I looked at her and I thought, wow, that's a really cool job she has. I'd really like to do that one day. And as it turns out, this woman was going on maternity leave, and they were asking me to take on her position. Now, they wanted me specifically because I had just spent 2 years in a government office, and even though the visit of I left out the fact that the National Committee was going to be hosting the visit of the Chinese ping pong team, maybe anywhere from 6 to 10 months later. And so Dick and Alex wanted me to come and take this year's leave of absence. I first wasn't sure I wanted to do it, but that's another long story, which I won't get into. I said yes, and I spent what I thought was going to be just a year after ping pong. It was a wonderful, exciting time, but I fully did expect to go back to the Foreign Service, but I kept asking for leaves of absence because what I was doing was so much fun and so interesting. Finally, after 4 years, the government said, look, you're either coming back into government work or not. And at that point, I sort of looked around at what I was doing, the kinds of responsibilities I had, the kind of independence I had, and I compared that with my fellow classmates in the A100 course for the Foreign Service and realized that staying in New York was much the better choice. So that's what I did, and 53 years later, I'm still there, and still, for the most part, enjoying it. So I've told you how I got to all these positions and how important the University of Michigan has been and was to me. It's sort of every major turn and decisions that I would be making about my career. There was someone from the University of Michigan right there to help me and offer me really wonderful, not just advice, but support as well. So just let me end, because I've probably gone over the 10 minutes, with a couple takeaways. One is to choose good professors and stay in touch with them. Another is to prepare yourself by getting the basic skills that you need in the field that you think you want to be in. But don't cut yourself off, because you can always learn new things, and you never know what's going to be right around the corner. And for me, it's not really a takeaway, because it's not a prescription of what to do, but I've found in my life that serendipity is really, it's been really important for me. I've just been really lucky that I've been in the right place at the right time with the right skills, and that was all very serendipitous. But what you need to do is, when something serendipitous falls into your lap, you need to be able to say, okay, maybe a turn in a direction that I didn't think I was going to take, but I should at least try it. And don't be shy about asking for help, whether it's from your professors or anyone else. And finally, always listen to your mother.
Well, thank you, Jan. A lot of things resonate there, and I look forward to, after all of the presentations, we'll gather questions. A lot of rich material that we want to explore. Our next panelist is Courtney Henderson, who is a partner at Due East Advisors, a consulting firm in Detroit that serves dynamic organizations working between the U.S., mainland China, and Taiwan. At Due East, she is the creative leader of strategy and operations. She previously served as deputy director of the Michigan-China Innovation Center, MCIC, and led the organization's FDI attraction, market development, and bilingual digital marketing strategy. Courtney has previously lived and worked in Washington, D.C., Shenzhen, China, and Taipei, Taiwan. Courtney majored in Chinese at the University of Notre Dame and received her master's in Chinese studies here at U of M. Courtney?
Thanks, Liz. My name is Courtney Henderson, and as Liz said, I co-founded Due East Advisors, which is a small international business consulting firm focused on mainland China and Taiwan. At Due East, we have clients in both the public and the private sectors, and I focus primarily on our public sector clients. And one of our firm's main clients is the state of Michigan, specifically Michigan's Economic Development Department, which is called the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, or MEDC. And I'll talk about that work in a little bit of detail because it's an interesting example of how you can do international work at the state and local levels. So big picture, what we do for MEDC is attract investment from mainland China, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia to Michigan. So to describe what that looks like, we identify companies in those regions who are interested in investing in the U.S. So they might want to set up a sales office or an R&D center, maybe a warehouse, manufacturing facility. And we persuade them to locate that investment here in Michigan rather than, say, Ohio or Texas or Canada. And we really compete for these projects because we want to create new jobs here in Michigan and also ensure that critical supply chains of the future are located here in our state. And this whole investment attraction process, from first time you meet a company and shake their hand until ribbon cutting, grand opening ceremony of their new Michigan facility, it can take years. And during that process, we collaborate with many, many other partners. So other colleagues at MEDC, government officials at the county and the city level, regional economic development partners, utility providers, service providers, so legal, banking, accounting, community partners, and federal government partners as well. So economic development is really, it's like a team sport. I would say that the best parts of my job, pre-COVID, I was traveling to mainland China and Taiwan about 4 times a year. Currently, it's more like 2 times a year. But I really love being Michigan-based and still being able to travel into market like that. I like the cross-country and cross-cultural collaboration, being able to use and improve my Chinese skills. And then finally, I especially love being part of bringing these new opportunities here to my home state of Michigan. So prior to my work at Due East Advisors, I was the deputy director at the Michigan China Innovation Center. That was a program funded by the last governor's administration to increase collaboration, business collaboration between Michigan and China. And that role had a lot of similarities to my current role, especially in the sense that it was focused on state-level international work for Michigan. While with that platform, I had the opportunity to support 3 trade and investment missions to China for our former governor, Rick Snyder's office. And I also got to manage a large bilateral exchange called Michigan China Week that brought government and business officials from 6 of Michigan's partner provinces here to our state. And finally, one of my favorite projects that I got to work on during that time was a series of subnational symposiums, which we held in co-partnership with Jan and her team at the National Committee, as well as Mary Gallagher and Ann Lin and their team at the Center for Chinese Studies. Those subnational symposiums were designed to connect state-level officials who work on China, like myself, with our colleagues in other states and China experts who are located across the country. So for me, this was an especially meaningful experience, not just because we had really fantastic collaborators, but also to come together with our fellow states, not as competitors for investment projects, which is how we typically engage with each other, but really as peers to learn together and have candid discussion about the challenges and opportunities that we saw with our subnational work with China. Okay, so now I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the path that I took to get to this kind of state-level international work. And I should really start by saying that I did not know this kind of work existed when I was a student here at U of M doing my MA in Chinese Studies. So it was not a direct path from there to here. I would say that back then, when I was graduating, I was really open to any number of China-related careers. I wasn't especially laser focused on a dream job or career path. I knew that I wanted work that was meaningful to me and that would allow me to have the kind of life that I wanted, which at the time had pretty low standards, I guess. I don't know. I wanted to be in the U.S. I wanted reasonable hours, and I wanted a living wage. So, so those were the filters I was applying to my post-grad job search. And right after finishing my degree, I moved to D.C. At that time, I just really wanted to live in D.C., and I invested a lot of time getting to know what were the China-related career opportunities there. I did quite a few informational interviews, and that's a strategy that I'd highly recommend to any students or young professionals out there. And I'll say that I'd be happy to do an informational interview with anyone here who is interested. So in DC, I first took an internship in Michigan Senator Carl Levin's office, and then took a job working at a trade association focused on renewable energy. So neither of those has very much to do with China, but the work was interesting and gave me a lot of really valuable exposure to how our government actually works, which is directly relevant to my current role. And on the side, I volunteered at an organization that supported low-income and underserved Asian American youth. After 3 years in DC, I made the decision to move back to Michigan to be closer to my family. And through networking, I learned about an opportunity to do some work for the state of Michigan, which is what I've been doing in one shape or another for the last 7 years. I should add that while I personally focus on mainland China, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia, I have colleagues at the MEDC who focus on Japan, on South Korea, India, and Europe. So this kind of work is available in a lot of different international markets. On top of that, each of the 50 states all have teams in their economic development departments that focus on international trade and investment. On top of that, at the local level, counties and cities have international specialists doing this kind of work too. So if what I described sounds interesting to you, there are really a lot of opportunities out there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Yes, a lot of exciting things. Our next panelist is Atlee Chait, who is a program specialist for the U.S. Department of State's Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, where she administers multi-million-dollar programs across the globe focused on women's economic security. Prior to this, she served in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and the Office of International Religious Freedom. Before joining the State Department, she was the Senior Election Analyst Assistant with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, as well as the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, Limited Election Observation Mission for the 2020 U.S. General Elections. She has also worked in the spheres of monitoring and evaluation, geopolitical risk and security, and development programming while living in Washington, D.C., Uganda, and Israel. Atlee holds a master's in international development and humanitarian emergencies from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a bachelor's in international studies from the University of Michigan, and she was a Princeton and Africa Fellow. And I'd also like to note, I've been told that Atlee was very helpful for the 20th anniversary of the II. So it's a real joy to welcome her back to the International Institute now as a presenter on this panel. So Atlee, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be back. As noted, my name is Atlee Chait. I graduated in 2014 from the PICS program here, and I currently live in DC. I work at the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, focused on global programming and women's economic security. I'm excited to be here in my own capacity. I just have to say that. While thinking through today to see what I would have wanted to hear as a graduate or undergraduate student, I thought through the ability to speak a little bit about my experiences and then potentially talk through a story that kind of shows a lot of the lessons that already have been mentioned here today. Right after graduation, I worked in risk consulting focused on sub-Saharan Africa while living in Israel. I soon found that I didn't really want to focus on the pessimistic lens on a day-to-day working in the international affairs arena. I moved to New York City to work on more program management skills, consulting, and then ended up back in DC wanting to work more in the international affairs world. Both in DC and in Uganda, I gained skills in monitoring and evaluation and women's economic security programming before going back in 2019 for my master's at the London School of Economics and Political Science, 4 years after graduating from my undergrad degree, which brought me full circle back to Washington, D.C., where I was focused on programming first on democracy and elections in Southern and East Africa, and then afterwards globally on international religious freedom and women's economic security. The main lesson that I have seen is it's unlikely that you will be or even know where you want to be right after graduating from either undergrad or graduate degree. But every single coffee chat that you have, every LinkedIn message that you send, every single email that you reach out to and follow up on is going to bring you closer to where you will know where you want to be and where you want to be, whether it's conscious or not. I know that sounds like a vague piece of advice, but I have some receipts. In fall 2013, I was a senior at the University of Michigan, and I attended the Princeton and Asia information session. I applied and did not get it. 3 years later, I applied to the Princeton in Africa fellowship, and I did receive it, whereas how I was able to live and work in Uganda for a full year without having attended the info session that the University of Michigan gave me exposure to. I wouldn't have known about the sister organization of Princeton in Africa, nor would I have applied 3 years later and received it. But I can do an even better. In December 2015, I was living in New York City. I was miserable in my job. I decided I wanted to move back to DC, and I went to stay with a friend for a week. Prior to that, I set up meetings with staffing firms, I set up unpaid internship interviews, and I sent tens and tens of LinkedIn messages out to people who were working in the programming space, women's economic security, gender equality, many different areas within Washington, D.C. Because I didn't do my undergrad or graduate in D.C., nor did I have any family or friends who had worked in the State Department or government or anything in general, I was green. I didn't know anything about it, and I was grateful for anybody who would take the time. I would say about 80% of those LinkedIn messages went unresponded to, but there was one woman who responded almost immediately, and I can remember exactly where we sat in the Starbucks on the DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., where we spoke about how to get into programming in D.C., what the government was like, entry points, who to reach out to, different things like that. She connected me to a friend who was currently living in New York City at the time, who worked more, I don't know if this is working or if it's me, it may just be me, who was working more in the security sector, but would be a really great contact. So when I went back to New York City, I spoke with her, and she introduced me to the Women's Foreign Policy Group, which was a networking group for like-minded individuals, young women who didn't know much about what was going on and wanted to get mentorship advice. So a couple of weeks later, I ended up moving to Washington, D.C. I was doing 2 part-time jobs. I was working in a restaurant at night and a staffing contract during the day, all to afford me to take the unpaid internship, which would align more closely with my career. The first full day that I was in Washington, D.C. was that mentoring fair for the Women Foreign Policy Group. And at that mentoring fair, it was kind of like speed dating for mentors, where each table had a couple mentors who were willing to speak to you about their expertise. Definitely intimidating to sit at a table and try to stand out and talk to everybody. But I ended up meeting my mentor that day, somebody who is still extremely influential in my career to this day. We have kept in touch in the years since then, as I went to Uganda, as I went to London. And when I came back to DC, she was the one who introduced me to one of the entry points to the State Department, which is contracting, which is not often talked about, but a majority of workers in the government today. She connected me to a contracting company that had an opening in 2021, and that was how I entered the State Department. Those colleagues are how I learned about my current office, Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, which would be a dream come true to move over to. And through networking, I now have been at this job for about 6 months. 1 month into that job, I was sitting on a conference call on Zoom with an organization that we were funding, and sitting across from me, mirrored in that, was the woman who I sat with for coffee in 2015. So I just have to be very clear, whether you see it or not, everything impacts where you're going. People will mention your names in rooms that you're not in, and you won't even be able to predict that. There is no linear path, as been said before. Just talk to people, take the time, answer questions, send LinkedIn messages. If people don't respond, they're busy, follow up. We all want to help each other, and we wouldn't be where we were if other people didn't take the time to speak to us. So, as I said, we're all here to help. So if you have questions, please feel free to follow up.
Thank you, Atlee. A lot of really good advice. And last but not least, our final panelist is Nessma Bashi, who is an attorney advisor at the Military Commissions Defense Organization, also in Washington, D.C., which ensures fairness and independence of the legal system. Prior to that, she was a legal officer and fellow at the Syria Justice and Accountability Center in Washington, D.C. Nessma received her bachelor's in international studies and Middle Eastern and North African studies here at U of M, and a few years later, her Juris Doctor as well. After law school, she was awarded the University of Michigan's Bates International Legal Fellowship, for which she traveled to Lesbos, Greece, and provided legal services to refugees and asylum seekers in 2018. Nessma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liz. It's so nice to be back on campus. Every time I'm back, I feel overwhelmed by this feeling of home. So thank you to the International Institute for letting me back and letting me feel that again. As Liz said, my name is Nessma. I am an attorney. I currently work with the Department of Defense. So like Atlee, I'm here in my own capacity. So I represent a detainee who is currently in Guantanamo Bay. He's been there for about 20 years now, held without charge. I won't be speaking too much about that today, but prior to this, I spent the last 3 years working on Syria. So my specialty is international criminal law, so war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. I'm Iraqi Christian. I belong to a really small minority group, so that's had a lot to do with how I kind of moved forward with my career trajectory and why my focus has very much been on the Middle East and North Africa. So with the Syria Justice and Accountability Center, I worked a lot with European police and prosecutors. So I basically oversaw a team mostly of Syrians who were in Syria, Turkey, and in Europe. We identified some individuals who had committed serious crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity in Syria who are currently in Europe, because a lot of people came over as refugees in 2015, 2016 onward. And with those refugees were some of the bad guys. So essentially, we kind of figured out who were the bad guys. We built up these case files and handed those off to the police, did all the investigations for them. So it was a really quick job for them, and it moved on to the prosecutors. So Europe is a little bit different than the US in the sense that you can try someone, you can indict someone for a crime that was committed in a different country if it has to do with a serious crime, which is why we were able to convict several individuals for major crimes, and they're in prison now. And throughout that process, the victims and the survivors got to engage and were a huge part of it. So the justice and accountability efforts are on the move in Syria, and that's what I've been involved in. Before that, I was clerking for a judge at the International Criminal Court, Judge Ibanez, who's originally from Peru. And as Liz mentioned before that, my first job out of law school was on a small island 4 miles away from the Turkish border, a Greek island called Lesbos. Anyone who follows immigration-related issues has heard of Lesbos. And at the time that I was there were about 9,000 people in a space that it really only had capacity for about 1,300. So crazy overcapacity. About a year later, went up to about 20,000. And at the time that I was there, was really the only Arabic-speaking attorney. So I was really thrown into things right after I graduated from Michigan. At a certain point, I couldn't walk through the camps because I had crowds of people come after me. And the only reason I was able to help so many people while I was there is because of Michigan law in particular, through the Bates Overseas Fellowship. Unfortunately, a lot of human rights positions don't pay well or at all. And so when you want to get into that sector, you do a lot of free work. And had it not been for Michigan, a lot of my work I would not have been paid for. I wouldn't have been able to do it. So take advantage of the opportunities at Michigan, not just the professors, but also the fellowships and all of those options. That's a huge piece of advice because we're so fortunate to go to this university and to have all of these people who are invested in us. So capitalize on it, I think, while you can. One thing that I've realized in my journey is that I think I'm kind of an oddball and no one has really known what the heck to do with me. Like at the law school, I remember the guidance counselors were like, okay, well, there are so many students that come in saying that they want to do international law, international criminal law in particular, or work with refugees. But then push comes to shove and they end up going to private law firms, which is great. I mean, my younger brother, who's also a double Wolverine, went that path and is at a big New York law firm and is really happy. So there's not that many people, though, that actually graduate and end up taking the path that I took. And I think because of that, the university was like, what do we do? How can we best help her? They didn't know how to best help me. So whereas the other students maybe had direct advice, the kids that wanted to go to the corporate firms or who wanted to go to the PD offices, it was a strict path. I didn't have that, but what I did have was faith from the counselors who said, look, we don't know what exactly to give you, what exact advice we can give you, but if you tell us what you want, we're going to do everything in our power to help you get there. And so I really, truly, I will repeat it, if it wasn't for Michigan and the faith that they had in me to do the work that I believe in, I wouldn't be here today. So one thing, I mentioned that, but one thing I also want to mention is I'm very lucky in the sense that I did always know what I wanted to do, which is very different than I think a lot of people. I think I have known since maybe 5th or 6th grade that I wanted to do human rights work. But I think that's because of the fact that I do come from a minority group from Iraq. I'm first generation here. My parents came here with no money. And I just felt so lucky to be in this country, but also confused because I grew up in the 9/11 era. And with the war in Iraq going on, it just was such a weird feeling. I constantly felt othered. Like when I was in the States, everyone was like, oh, well, you're Iraqi. But when I was in the Middle East, everyone was like, oh, you're American. And so I didn't quite know how to deal with all of that. I just knew that I was seeing a lot of injustice around me, and something felt off, even as that fifth grader, that sixth grader, watching the bombs go off over Baghdad and knowing that my family there was going to be at risk, but also like seeing what was going on here. So again, that constant juxtaposition made me innately aware of injustice, and I knew that this was the path I wanted to take, but I had no idea how to get there. So I think my advice would be to be open to pivoting. There's a power in pivoting, and know that if you have a goal in the long term, there's multiple ways to get there. In a way, it doesn't matter how you get there, it's just that you got there. For me, I knew I wanted to do this human rights career. I knew I wanted to work for the UN. Now I've spent time at multiple UN agencies. I almost did a third until my security clearance came through and I finally got this job. So I knew what I wanted and I went after it. I just had to be open to the different paths that were available to me. So yeah, I'll leave time for questions because I know we're running short. And thank you guys for taking the time to come and listen.
Thank you, Nessma. Yes, wow. Wow, this is a really inspiring group of people. And I definitely want people to feel free to come up. We have microphones on both sides of the stage. So please come up and ask your questions. And I have some questions. Please introduce yourself.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much. I'm actually a staff member at the International Institute, so I realize I'm taking liberties. My name is Melissa Vert, and we work in the fellowships and grants. I just want to say what a privilege it is to talk with such incredible people and recognize that you are a full woman panel. That's really impressive, just for me in my career, and I'd like to hope for others as well. I wanted to ask something that I think is potentially a little bit simple. In your work and your career, I would imagine that you have experienced, not just as women, but as people, someone who told you, no, I don't think you know what you're doing. I don't think you can handle this. This isn't the right thing for you. There's probably something else out there. And I would love to hear what kept you going despite the fact that there might have been someone who thought that you weren't capable of doing what you're doing. And then for us as potentially staff and faculty, what we can do to make sure that we are helping other people to see the potential that they have rather than stopping them from doing something. And again, thank you very much.
I was very fortunate in my career. I can only think of one instance where that happened. My first boss in Hong Kong, I was warned when I came in that he didn't like young officers and he didn't like female officers. That was great. And I remember it didn't manifest itself so much on a day-to-day basis, but certain things I was afraid, like I met a couple guys and girls, women on a ferry boat ride across the harbor one day, and they were going to be taking off and going to Cambodia, to Angkor Wat, and I'd always wanted to go, and they said, come with us, and they were just backpacking, and I really wanted to do it. I didn't have I was fairly new, I'd only been there 5 or 6 months, and everybody said, don't ask Sandy, you haven't proven yourself yet. So I didn't, and I didn't go with them, and I was always I finally did make it there later, but I felt I had my comeuppance because so when you're in the Foreign Service, the State Department sends out inspection teams to when you're at an embassy or consulate abroad. And they have on the inspection teams made up of one Foreign Service officer and one totally independent person, and I forget what the third one was. And we had one coming to our offices, and I was a little concerned because this was in the we were in the middle of a war, and there were a lot of protests going on, and I was in Hong Kong in September of '69, or maybe it was '70, when the major March on Washington took place. And I knew as a Foreign Service officer, there are a lot of wonderful things about being in the State Department, but there are some things that are not so wonderful, and that is you can't, at least publicly, be going out and speaking against your government. So I didn't think it was appropriate. I knew people who were going to be protesting at the consulate. I didn't think it was appropriate for me to do that, so I just took off and went to the beach and spent the day, on the beach. And this guy, Sandy Marlowe, when he found out that I had taken the day off, and it was because I didn't want to be at work on that day, he was furious. And he said, "You just wait till those inspectors come, and you're going to be sorry." The inspectors came. I was very proactive about it. I happened to live, because I was the lowest ranking officer in the consulate. I lived right across the street in the building where the Marine Guards lived and the administrative staff lived. So I invited the 3 inspectors over for lunch, because I wanted to get my story out before Sandy told them the story. And I said, you're going to hear some things from Mr. Marlowe, but I just want to tell you my side of the story. And I told them how I was trying to be respectful, but I had my own values, and I wanted to live up to them. And the 3 of them started laughing. The independent guy said, "I think that's pretty," he was a spunky New Englander who owned a newspaper. And he said, "I think that's terrific, and can I write a story about it?" And then the fellow who was a Foreign Service officer, he was from India, and he said, "Jan, if Sandy starts talking to me about you taking off the day on your own," he said, I did the opposite from you. I did a public protest. I used the embassy's mimeograph machine to encourage people to come with me and protest. So you don't have to worry. We're not going to penalize you for the job." But in answer to your question, if someone had said to me, "No, you can't do this," that would make me want to do it all the more, just to prove that they were wrong.
I can briefly touch on that too. I'm constantly getting pushback even to this day. I think part of that comes from family, it comes from community and culture, depending on where you're from. And I think for me, I come from a community where a lot of girls get married at 21, 22, and they rely on their husbands, and that just was not how I was raised, and that's not how I am. I've always known what I wanted, like I said, and so when all of these people were like, "What are you doing?" picking, not just going to school, but picking the most unstable legal career path out there, what is going on, definitely made me think, because I'm also a people pleaser, and I want everyone to be happy. I want my parents to be happy. I want, to make them proud, and for the community to be proud of me. But one thing I've learned is that the most important thing is that you believe in yourself. And I really believed in the mission that I have, and I have always felt that I've had a calling, and so I trusted that calling. So I think, again, believe in yourself and know that no matter what, it will work itself out if it's really what you want to do. And it's funny because nowadays, my parents will go to they'll go to community events, and they're just so proud to be like, "Oh, this is what my daughter does." All the grief that my parents gave me in between undergrad and law school, I was living in Jordan. And oh my God, the amount of I came home from Jordan because I felt so guilty. I remember I had gotten a job with UNRWA, and the UN Relief and Works Agency in Palestine, and I was so excited. I'm like, "This is gonna be amazing." And my parents were like, "Get your butt home." So I came home out of guilt. But you know what? Now my dad will be in front of the community and be like, "Yeah, she works for the United Nations." I'm like, "Dad, I don't work for the UN anymore." You know what I mean? But they get really proud. And so if you believe in yourself, everyone will follow suit. But for the university, for the question regarding the university and what the university could do, I think it's totally okay to acknowledge when you don't have the exact advice to give a student. And I think that was my situation in the law school, that again, they didn't really know what to do with me, but they said, look, here are financial opportunities. Come up with an idea and we'll talk you through what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, and we'll figure it out together. And I think just showing that you're at least open to the student's idea makes a big difference in terms of, you know, them having faith in themselves and them knowing that they come from a university that also has faith in them.
I remember vividly, I had reached out to do an informational conversation with somebody who worked at an organization that I had done research on and potentially wanted to join. There were open positions. And after I kind of introduced myself, he said, yeah, you have too many gaps on your resume. You don't have the right expertise. Like, I don't think this is for you. And I remember leaving that call and crying, because when somebody tells you that, who's in a career path that you potentially want to go into, that's, you know, one of those moments where they never should have said that. But separately, you kind of are left in a spiral, because you're like, maybe this is true. Maybe everybody else has been telling me I can do this, and this person who works in the field is right. Who knows? But a major thing that has become very important is recognizing how to speak about your own expertise and your own resume. Having gaps in your resume is not a problem. Especially in our field, potentially not being in a job for longer, that is not a problem. Being able to speak about what you're doing, transferable skills, is exceptionally important. And so I would say at the university, teaching students how to talk about their resume, how to talk about the expertise that they have, the transferable skills, being confident in going into a call like that. So if somebody does say that, you know, obviously read the room, whether it's time to say something back or not. But if it is time to say something back, being able to articulate, you know, in fact, some of the roles and responsibilities of this job, I do feel like I have expertise from XYZ, you know, experiences, and being able to talk about that. So I do think that in addition to kind of panels like this, obviously, as you guys mentioned at the beginning, it is a Friday afternoon. However, as much as you can bring people into actual courses where students have to attend, just exposure, as what was said, like, I didn't know anything about contracting. I didn't know anybody in the State Department. I wouldn't have known that my job existed or how to get to it. So people oftentimes don't even know what they could possibly do because they just have never been exposed to it. So I would say continued exposure and making sure that they feel strengthened in their skills and being able to speak about them is really important.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm back running through my memories, trying to think of a specific or explicit examples of someone saying something, but I think more generally it was a feeling that I had, being often the youngest woman in the room, youngest person in the room, and maybe only woman in the room, of a feeling of like awkwardness and sometimes encountering people who didn't understand what my position was or assumed that I was there as a note taker, as like a secretary, and not as like a member of a delegation traveling on behalf of state of Michigan with a role on a project. Those were, they shook my confidence, like those moments when someone would not shake my hand or move to the next man standing next to me and shake his hand. It didn't happen often, but once or twice is enough to put some doubts in your head about, well, why am I here and what is my role? And I think that saying things to other colleagues and not just like keeping it like within my own mind as like is that real? Is it not real? But talking to other people and having other people either validate what I saw or just be on the lookout more for me in that role going forward was really helpful. And then additionally, I'm now a mother, and I get a lot of feedback about, well, how can you possibly do that role and be a mother? You must not be able to do both. And similarly, I think like talking to other people who are around me, either who might be in the same rooms or who are just there to have my back and talk me through things has been really helpful just to get perspective. So I would say that at the university, if you're in a mentoring role and someone comes to you with concerns or experiences, or like, I think I experienced this thing, but I'm not really sure, just to validate and to, I guess, look out for, for future experiences like that in order to help them through it.
Yes, thank you for the thought-provoking question, and a lot of the answers really resonate with me, and I also am thinking, I was going through my memories too, and luckily nothing stands out so strongly about a disparaging remark, but I do remember clearly when someone built me up as an undergrad in a male-dominated history class. It was all males except me, and I still remember that professor encouraging me to major in history, get me to talk in class, and building me up. And so sometimes so the opposite can be true. Like, you never know when you're encouraging someone how big an impact that might make, and years later, that those things also stick with you, the positive moments. So, giving compliments to colleagues or students or faculty instead of having a more competitive atmosphere can really, really make a difference. I see we have another question over here. Yes.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your stories and your perspective on many issues within international regional studies. My name is Arina Vlasova-Bustillos, and I'm a staff member here, and I also happen to be alumna of the Masters in International Regional Studies program here at the University of Michigan. So I kind of wanted to continue this unpleasant topic of dismissal in a way, and this time I wanted to ask you about dismissal of your expertise in regional and area studies in general. Unfortunately, it seems like in academia and pro-profit organizations, there's this notion that area studies are dying out, that they're unnecessary, that we are moving more towards the generalistic approach and not the regional approach. And I imagine this really affects a lot of students who are pursuing this specialization these days. So I wanted to ask you if you had any experiences with this in the past, maybe you have any experiences with this now, or you see any younger professionals who are dealing with this, and maybe if you have any advice how to navigate it in job search, besides pivoting, I suppose, and anything other that comes to mind in this sphere. Thank you.
Well, I know, I feel very strongly the lack of regional study. So I'm really old, and when I was a student, regional area studies were really important, and that's what you did if you were interested in Russia or in Turkey or in Jordan or wherever. You went to a school, and most universities and colleges had area studies. Nowadays, it's really hard to find area studies programs, except in small liberal arts colleges, where they're still very important and very powerful. And I'm always delighted when I see on a job application someone who's gone through an area study program, because that's, maybe it's just it's what I did in both China and Japan, and I really appreciated the breadth of knowledge. You don't always get the same depth, but for me, I was more interested in the breadth and the ability to have some cross-fertilization while I was in an area studies program. It wasn't all just on political science or history or mathematics or whatever it was. You got a much broader plate to eat from. And I felt so strongly about it that in our organization, we started a program in 2002, maybe, about almost 20 years ago, called our Public Intellectuals Program. And it didn't start off as a Public Intellectuals Program. It started off because of my desire to get back to an area studies kind of experience for people in the field. When Mike Lampton and Ken Dwoskin, who are sitting over there, and I went to college, area studies was not a dirty word, and we learned it. And the field, the China field then was so small that when people got together, if you went to the Association of Asian Studies for a conference, there were maybe 150 China specialists there, And we all knew each other. We all got together. So the sociologists talked to the historians who dated the political scientists and there was, by osmosis, there was a lot more exchange between people in different disciplines. And my sense was that our generation's view, my sense is, our generation's view of China is a very different one than the younger generation. It's not to say that either are bad. The younger generation, their language is infinitely better because they had a chance to go in, ask questions, dive deep into their own discipline and get to know what it was like in a village in Henan in 1932, whereas we couldn't do that. And also, Mike Lampton, who's sitting there, who was my boss at the National Committee for a wonderful, almost 10-year period, he'd always say, Jan, we're not training our revolutionary successors. So I started a program that is now in its 8th cohort, a 2-year cohort, which purposely brings together people from different disciplines in China, anthropologists and sociologists and political scientists, for programs that get them talking to one another and learning from one another, precisely because you don't have area studies. And it's been very, very successful.
I'll just add, I think at this point in my career, I've been so fortunate to be in such different spaces, like international spaces. And, I think when I was younger, I always thought places like the UN or the International Criminal Court, oh, everyone there must be so smart. And just, I've had like major imposter syndrome in some of those spaces. But then you spend some time there and you're like, there are some people talking about these areas that really should not be talking so loud. So I'm a big advocate of area studies because I think that's what makes you the most informed. And when you get into those spaces, you are giving good advice that impacts a lot of people. So I love area studies. I think it's the best thing for us, but just get to know the big players in your field, but don't put all your eggs in one basket when it comes to thinking about who these big players are. Because again, like I learned the hard way that I just thought, maybe it was my own self-confidence and not having it along the way, that I thought, oh, some of these people are just, oh my God, they're just the most brilliant people. And then I met them and I was like, oh, good Lord, So know the big players, but have some faith in yourself and, try to really figure out, who's got the actual opinion that is impactful and intelligent and move forward from there. I could tell you, my previous boss at the Syria Justice and Accountability Center, his name is Mohammed Abdullah. He is one of the best people I've ever met in my life. I mean, he's truly like family to me at this point. He was a political prisoner in Syria. He comes from an awesome family of human rights advocates in Syria. I messaged this guy like 7 years ago on LinkedIn being like, I know you don't know who I am, but I think you're amazing. He was like a celebrity to me. And he didn't respond. And then I started working for SJAC and he's like, I think I remember you're the girl that sent me a message like years ago, and he went back and found it. So yeah, it just goes to show, again, you lose 100% of the shots you don't take, and area studies is the best, so know the players.
I'd say the biggest obstacle I faced with like an area studies MA was just in the professional world, people not really knowing what to do with that. So the question was always like, okay, so you do China, but what? China plus what? And people were like very clear that like that was the equation, and I needed to like put myself in, I needed to answer that equation for them to make sense of me, for them to like help navigate me in a career direction. And in a way it was fair because I didn't really have like a lot of clear direction about where I wanted to go. So it prompted me to do some more self-reflecting. But honestly, I think there was just like an awkward career phase where it was a little fake it till you make it. And, now I can say, okay, China plus economic development, or China plus regional study, or China plus, subnational relations. That's my like China plus answer. But yeah, there was a little bit of fake it till you make it until I got there. And certainly I think that I wouldn't be able to do the work that I'm doing effectively without an area studies background.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Quinn, and I am a third-year master's student. I'm a dual degree in Chinese Studies plus public policy. I first wanted to say thank you so much. I want to echo what Melissa said earlier regarding just the all-female panel. As a student, it's really impactful just to see women in the careers that I want to go into. My question has to do more with a skill or maybe something you wished you had maybe invested more time in your academic career, maybe now. I think about like maybe the challenges that I will engage with in my career and like things that I could have spent more time on, whether that's quant skills or believing in myself, just like one skill that you wished you had focused on more.
Time management. Terrible at that.
So I think it kind of depends on where you might want to go in, as you said, for like quantitative. So monitoring evaluation for programming, being able to manage successes, understand indicators, understand like logic models and things like that is very, very important. They're needed. People who have that expertise are needed everywhere, and they aren't often found. So even if that's not your focus, having some sort of base level ability to do that and then be able to speak to that in interviews will set you ahead. But again, if you're not a numbers person, then don't do that, because then you'll be responsible for all of that. So I think again, understanding what everybody's been saying up here, like imposter syndrome's real. The people in the jobs also have it. I, to this day, have imposter syndrome, probably will never go away. So being able to manage it and learn how to kind of like make yourself more of a value add in a position, make yourself feel better about going into those rooms and speaking, doing the background, reading, whatever it is, talking to your colleagues to understand how they got to where they are so you can make yourself, again, a value add, but recognizing that you wouldn't have been hired or put in that space if they did not see you as a value add. So kind of reminding yourself on the day-to-day basis. But again, quantitative skills are important. Being able to write is really important. Being able to craft a narrative, being able to, synthesize down a lot of notes from a meeting or things like that, being able to talk about next steps in a concise way, all is very, very important and things that you can learn at university for sure.
For me, the answer is language skills. It's something that I don't think you can ever invest enough in. I still take Chinese classes every other week, and it's been 15 years. I think that having the ability to connect with somebody in their native language it completely changes the conversation. It opens doors, it builds relationships, and for me and the type of work I do, that's essential.
Except I would add the problem with language skills for you and for anyone who's learning something other than an English cognate. You can't do it 3 hours a week, or an hour a day, 3 days a week. You have to really immerse yourself to get the language skills like you or I would want them. I mean, I started here at Michigan, and in those days, when I said to you there was a reason I couldn't read, was because in those days Michigan didn't, if you wanted to study modern China, you could take the first and second year Chinese. That was it. They didn't have anybody beyond it to teach modern language, and if you wanted to continue with Chinese, you had to study classical Chinese. And I wasn't sure enough that I wanted China to spend 4 hours a night with a dictionary reading Confucius, and so I stopped taking the language because I couldn't go anymore. And my senior year, at the end of my senior year, they brought in the wonderful Harriet Mills here, who then revolutionized language training at Michigan in Chinese. But for a long time, they didn't have it. But even with someone like Harriet, you really can't learn a language like Chinese or even Japanese or something that's so totally alien to our native language with the limited amount of time you can get in a college course.
I'll just follow up on both of those points and say that field work is so important. I think if you get an opportunity to be in your area of specialty, take it, because especially when you're younger and like you don't have as many obligations as you do down the road, seize the opportunity. And that's also how you gain a lot of traction when it comes to the languages. I'm really fortunate because I grew up with Arabic, and so it came naturally to learn how to read and write, and when I'm in the region, it flows. And I feel so bad because I have some colleagues who are so interested in the region. They could tell you the history of the Middle East, but when it comes down to learning Arabic, they have struggled to do it, and they will never be able to get certain positions without the language skills. So take the opportunity to do the field work, and that will help you with the language. If you're interested in going to law school, take some speed reading classes, and you'll be good to go.
I wouldn't hire myself at the committee if I were to go and ask for a job. I would not hire because my Chinese isn't nearly as good as it should be. And that's the one place where Michigan failed me. Everything else was great, but not language.
It was before the International Institute, so we could feel good about
But I would
that.
also say, I don't know if Michigan does this, but I remember very clearly when I was living in Hong Kong, a woman named Susan Shirk, who some of you will know because she's a big star in the China world. She was studying at MIT, and half a year, the summer before she was going to be sent out to do her field work, MIT gave her the opportunity to go live in Hong Kong for 3 months just to see if she would like it, if the food agreed with her, if she could take the summer heat. And I thought that was a wonderful plan for universities to do that because they didn't want her to fail. They were setting her up for, to win and to be good at it. So I don't know if universities are able to do that, but if you can, it's a wonderful thing. The International Institute should have that as a goal for all of the areas.
I want to see if anyone has any final burning questions before we have the reception. Yes, please come up to the microphone.
Hi, I'm a freshman at LSNA, and I'm currently thinking of majoring in PPE, Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. In terms of international or regional studies, I'm seriously thinking about a dual degree or a minor in Southeast Asian studies, and I'm actually taking Filipino as a first year right now. And I was just wondering, because in terms of my career, I would really like to be able to live abroad. How doing regional studies, part of my hesitance is, does that lock me into that particular region in terms of where I could live in my career? Or are there organizations that you guys have heard of that kind of help the diasporas all over the world?
I think it's really amazing that the university is teaching Filipino. I think that's very cool. And just because you start with one thing doesn't mean you can't change your mind. We try something because we're interested and we like it, and we either like it and go on or say, well, that wasn't for me. So next week I want to take Swahili and see where that gets me. So don't feel that just because you begin with one course that you have to follow that just because you made that initial commitment. Change your mind. It's fine.
I agree with that. It took me a minute to kind of think about it, but it's very true in that you're never stuck with anything, right? And I think the important thing is, and you talked about this, Atlee, but basically being able to market your skills. Whatever you do, no matter what job you get or whatever you're studying, whatever, just be able to pick out what those skills are. And I think it's the skills that are transferable. So if you focus on that, because my focus is obviously the Middle East, but I've also been able to connect with a lot of human rights lawyers doing stuff specifically in Latin America. Partly I'm just really interested in Latin American culture because it has a lot of parallels with Middle East culture and all of that. But that's where the skills come into play. For me, it's the legal skills, being able to dissect things, dissect issues, all of that. So I don't think you're locked in. I think focus on the skills and you'd probably be fine.
Yeah, there are definitely organizations that work with diaspora communities. I will not be the right person to answer that specific question, but I can speak with regards to the State Department, for better or for worse, people are moved around all the time. They're moved around to different regions. They're moved around to different functional areas. So the people, again, as you said, the people you are looking at as experts, there's no guarantee that that is all they've been doing for their entire career. I definitely recommend, looking into either organizations or finding people and then reading their LinkedIn, see how they got there, what exactly they did, not to replicate it, but to be, to feel better about the fact that they also probably didn't know what they wanted to do or didn't know how to get there. And just being in an organization or being in a space doesn't preclude you from being in another space. It is about the transferable skills. It is about just continuing networking and knowing what's out there. So definitely do what you are interested in and keep having those conversations and learning about the organizations that might work with the types of populations that you would want to work in. But it in no way should preclude you from that, and nor should you let anybody tell you that.
Wow. Well, I am thoroughly inspired. It's funny. Last week I had my palm read by funnily enough, by a Cree speaker. Our writer who was here last week also read palms, and apparently I'm going to have several more careers in my life. So I have a lot to think about from this panel. A lot of really exciting options. So I want to thank I want to thank everyone for coming and staying to the end, and to thank this excellent panel. And it was a privilege to be up here with you. So.
All right, good afternoon. Again, thank you for the wonderful panel. I think it's just an incredible way to close this incredible symposium. And again, I just would make note of all the women that are actually in this panel. Our particular field is filled with women, and so it's just powerful and a great way to end this particular session. By way of introduction, my name is Imara Dawson. I'm the Chief Administrator and Managing Director of the International Institute, and I'm here to just segue into our reception. But before that, it's just been a wonderful day and a half. The richness of the discussion and the collective energy to celebrate the II's 30th anniversary has just really been inspiring. And so I also want to just give a special word of gratitude, especially to our dedicated staff that have been working tireless behind the scenes, doing that invisible labor that's absolutely essential to make these type of programs go well. So again, thank you for all that work that they've been doing behind the scenes. Again, I also want to say I trust you, I trust everyone like me, that these sessions have left our hearts and minds fuller with the enlightening panels and also the keynote address. And also I want to make sure that as we've nourished our bodies and souls, now it's a great time for us to commune with each other at the end of this particular symposium. And so with a heart full of gratitude and hope for continued success and growth at the II, I declare this symposium officially closed. Please enjoy yourself at the reception, and thank you again.